I've been thinking about what I wanted to talk about to myself this morning, and as I walk to work, and I'm kind of torn between two. And so we'll see if I just try to be as brief as slightly possible. Maybe I'll be able to make two. So the first thing that I've been thinking about is, the notion of history repeating itself. This is something that I've been discussing online recently, and I've been discussing the purpose, the usefulness of this notion, and that the notion that history repeats itself actually has very little to do with history itself, other than using history as a means of inferring legitimacy for current designs and future designs. I want to show that the way I say the world is today and should be tomorrow is legitimate. And so I reach back into history and I manipulate signs and symbols, transforming them into my image, and then I'm justified. That's the purpose of this idea of history repeating itself. Now, I think a possible way of thinking about this is thinking about what this idea of history repeating itself functions as. It doesn't function as historical study. It functions as mythologizing. Myth is entirely about creating a narrative that explains the world, explains how the world should be, how it should be ordered, who should hold power, who should make decisions, who should be in positions of servitude, who should take the lead, who should follow. That's the purpose of myth, to explain the order of the universe. Hugh Nibley, an LDS scholar, used to say that the LDS temple is a scale model of the universe. And what he means by that, I think he would push back because he's very negative when it comes to myth. But I would say that what he's saying is that the temple experience is mythic, and it's explaining how the universe ought to be ordered, to then infer that that's how it is ordered, to then justify that order. So it's like a self-perpetuating justification, relying on itself for its own authority. That's what myth is, and that's what this idea of history repeating itself does, is it mythologizes myth in order to do just that. So, in thinking of this idea not as a principle of the study of history, but as a principle of myth, we could then turn to Franz Boas. Franz Boas, freaking cobwebs. Franz Boas is known as the father of American anthropology. He's a figure that I think sad that he hasn't remained as prominent, and sad that he hasn't continued to be read. I talked to an anthropology professor about my interest in Boas and what Boas I should read. If I was going to start reading Boas, where should I start? And he said, well, it's kind of a difficult question because nobody reads Boas anymore. They just read about Boas. And then he referred me to a text, which is Boas's On the Mind of Primitive Man. Now, the title of this text, this book, kind of sounds today like we hear that primitive and we're like, oh, that's It's not a word that gets thrown around anymore, that kind of has a pejorative connotation to it. But this text comes out of a different time. And so, Boas is going to be a reflection of his time to some degree. The book is actually arguing against social hierarchy theories, that cultures exist on a hierarchical spectrum, and that they have to move through these stages of civilization, and that one culture could be higher up this pyramid of civilization, or this scale of civilization, than another. So he's arguing against that. He's also arguing against ideas like eugenics and these kinds of theories that are being thrown around in the early 20th century. He actually publishes the book twice. Once in the first couple decades of the 19th century, or the 20th century, excuse me, and then again in the 1930s, I believe, as kind of a reply argument against the eugenics theories that are being bandied about the world in that time, most prominently in Germany. So earlier he's arguing against these kind of white supremacist ideas in the 1910s, and then later he's arguing more directly against the Nazis. So anyways, in this book, I told you I couldn't be brief. In this book, he talks about myth and totemism and their function and their dispersion, and how social hierarchy theories will look at this dispersion and see in it evidence for their hierarchy. And to do that, they infer that, well, look, the symbol started here, and then it moved here, and then it moved here, and then it moved here, and so these were under the influence of this one civilization. And he says that it's incorrect to assume that when it comes to myth, that the borrowing, the adoption of mythic symbols isn't done according to a model like that. And it doesn't imply continuity of meaning. That just because a symbol pops up in one place after another does not mean that it's the same symbol. Because cultures borrow these symbols from each other, not because of what the symbol means in its original context, but because of how the culture that's borrowing the symbol can refashion, make use of the symbol in their own context to communicate meaning. So the borrowing of mythic symbols is not about what the symbol means in its original context. It's entirely about how the borrowing context can remake that symbol in its own image to communicate a self-justifying message. That describes this insistence on history repeating itself. History repeating itself is ignoring many important things to the context of whatever history it's seeing repeating itself. It's blurring those lines between periods, between epochs, between actors, between events, and making everything out to look the same. The kind of interesting thing is that it does this blurring of lines in order to make everything look the same, in order to then turn around and take these symbols to impose rigid lines of exclusion. So it's kind of an interesting phenomenon, I guess. But yeah, that's so history doesn't repeat itself. The notion that history does repeat itself is just making use of borrowed symbols, alienated from their original context, in order to justify the outlook of the borrowed context.